The first rays of November light hadn't yet cleared the peaks when Marcus Webb pushed open the door of his cabin, coffee mug in hand, expecting nothing more than the usual silence of Crescent Ridge Ranch. What he found instead stopped his heart cold. Standing on his weathered porch, trembling against the pre-dawn chill, was a horse so white it seemed carved from moonlight itself. The animal's coat gleamed pale as fresh snow, its mane tangled with frost and burrs. But it wasn't the horse's impossible beauty that made Marcus freeze. It was the desperation burning in its eyes, and the small, motionless form lying at its hooves. A foal, gray as storm clouds, lay crumpled on the wooden planks, its shallow breaths barely stirring the cold air. Marcus had spent 20 years fighting wildfires across the West, had seen men make impossible choices in the face of certain death, but nothing had prepared him for this. A wild Mustang, magnificent and untamed, had climbed onto his porch not to threaten, but to plead. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Webb's hands shook as he set the coffee mug down on the porch rail, the liquid inside gone cold the moment his eyes had registered what stood before him. The white horse, easily 16 hands high, possessed a presence that seemed to pull the very air tight around them. Steam rose from its nostrils in rhythmic clouds, each breath measured and deliberate. The animal's legs bore scars from barbed wire and rough terrain, evidence of a life spent navigating the unforgiving landscape of the Wind River Basin. Its hooves, unshod and chipped, had carried it across miles of frozen ground to reach this place, this man, this moment. The foal at its feet twitched once, a spasm that could have been life fighting to stay or the last tremor before surrender. Marcus dropped to one knee, his bad back protesting the sudden movement with a familiar lance of pain. The injury from his firefighting days never let him forget that moment when burning timber had come crashing down, pinning him long enough to end his career and reshape every day that followed. He reached toward the foal, then hesitated, his gaze lifting to meet the white horse's stare. Those eyes held an intelligence that unsettled him. Not the simple awareness of a domestic animal, but something deeper, older, as if the creature understood exactly what it was asking. Marcus had read about wild Mustangs his whole life, knew their reputation for fierce independence and their unwillingness to trust humans. Yet here stood one that had overcome every instinct to bring its dying offspring to a stranger's door. The sky above Wind River Basin stretched endless and gray, heavy with the promise of snow. November in Wyoming didn't ease into winter. It arrived with brutal efficiency, turning the world sharp and unforgiving overnight. The sagebrush that dotted Marcus's failing ranch had already taken on that brittle quality that spoke of deep cold settling in for the long months ahead. In the distance, beyond the sagging fence lines and overgrown pastures, the mountains rose like broken teeth against the horizon. Marcus lived alone now, had for 4 years since Kathleen died. Cancer had taken her slowly, eating away at her strength until the vibrant woman who had convinced him to buy this ranch became a whisper of herself. The medical bills had consumed their savings, then their credit, then any hope of keeping Crescent Ridge running properly. The bank's letters came monthly now, each one a little more insistent than the last, each one counting down the days until foreclosure became inevitable. He had stopped going into Greystone except when absolutely necessary. The pitying looks from neighbors who remembered him as the hotshot firefighter, the man who had run toward danger while others fled, those looks cut deeper than any flame ever had. Now he was just another failed rancher, another stubborn fool trying to hold on to land that wanted to return to the wild. But this morning, none of that mattered. The white horse stamped once, not aggressively, but with clear intention. The sound echoed across the empty yard, bounced off the weathered barn where Marcus no longer kept livestock, carried past the rusted equipment he couldn't afford to repair. It was a summons, a demand, a question all compressed into a single gesture. Marcus bent lower, his calloused hands hovering over the foal. The little one's coat felt ice-cold beneath his touch, the kind of cold that spoke of hours spent exposed to the elements. He could see now where blood had matted the fur along its hindquarters, a wound that had stopped bleeding but left behind a crusty darkness. The foal's ribs showed too prominently beneath its skin, suggesting days without proper nursing. Its eyes remained closed, the lids fluttering occasionally as if caught in dreams it might never wake from. Moving carefully, broadcasting his intentions through slow, deliberate motions, Marcus slid his arms beneath the foal's body. The animal weighed less than he expected, all fragile bones and thin muscle wrapped in hide that should have been supple but felt papery with dehydration. He lifted, and the foal's head lolled against his chest, the small muzzle pressed against the worn fabric of his work shirt. The white horse watched every movement, its massive head lowering to track the foal's transfer. Marcus half expected the animal to strike, to reclaim its offspring with violence born of maternal instinct. Instead, the horse simply followed as Marcus carried the foal inside, its hooves clicking against the porch boards with surprising delicacy for a creature so large. Inside the cabin, warmth from the wood stove's overnight embers still lingered in the air. Marcus had built the fire high before bed, one of the few comforts he still allowed himself. The interior reflected 4 years of gradual deterioration, not from neglect exactly, but from the absence of care. Dust gathered in corners that Kathleen would have never tolerated. Dishes sat stacked beside a sink that had developed a slow drip he kept meaning to fix. The walls, once decorated with photographs and small mementos of their life together, now stood mostly bare. He had packed those things away when the memories became too sharp to bear. He cleared the kitchen table with one arm, sweeping aside unopened mail and a half-read paperback, then laid the foal on the worn wooden surface. The little one's breathing came in stutters, each inhale a struggle, each exhale a question mark. Marcus pressed 2 fingers against its neck, searching for a pulse. There, faint but present, a thread of life still connecting this small creature to the world. The white horse had followed him inside, an absurdity that would have been comical under different circumstances. The animal filled the doorway, too large for the domestic space, yet it stood perfectly still, watching. Marcus could hear its breathing, deep and steady, so different from the foal's desperate gasps. He needed supplies, needed knowledge he didn't possess. Marcus had fought fires, had training in emergency medicine for humans, but animals were different. Their bodies worked by rules he only half understood. He grabbed an old blanket from the closet, the one Kathleen had used during her worst days, and wrapped it around the foal, trying to trap what little body heat remained. The foal's tongue protruded slightly from its mouth, dried and cracked. Dehydration, definitely. Marcus filled a shallow bowl with lukewarm water from the tap, then reconsidered. Animals this young didn't drink like adults. He needed something to help the water go down easier, something to provide energy. His eyes fell on the honey jar in the cupboard, the same jar that had sat untouched since Kathleen died. She had loved honey in her tea during the treatments, said it was the only sweet thing that didn't taste like medicine. He mixed honey into the water, his large hands clumsy with the spoon, then dipped his finger into the mixture and brought it to the foal's lips. The little one didn't respond at first, the liquid simply rolling off its mouth and darkening the blanket beneath. Marcus tried again, this time gently prying the mouth open and letting a drop fall onto the tongue. The foal's throat worked reflexively, a swallow so small it was almost invisible. But it was there. Marcus released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He tried again, another drop, another tiny swallow. It wasn't much. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But it was something, and something was better than watching life slip away without a fight. Behind him, the white horse shifted its weight, and Marcus glanced back. The animal had moved closer, its head now hanging over his shoulder, close enough that he could feel the warmth of its breath against his neck. There was something deeply unsettling about having a wild Mustang in his kitchen, close enough to bite or strike. Yet the threat felt distant, superseded by a shared purpose that transcended species. Marcus continued his work, administering drops of honey water with the patience of someone who had spent long nights tending to another person slipping away. Each swallow became a small victory. Each breath the foal managed to take a promise that maybe, just maybe, This wouldn't end the way so many things in his life had ended. The light outside shifted as true dawn arrived, pale and weak through the cabin's dusty windows. The wind had picked up, rattling the loose boards on the barn and whistling through gaps in the cabin's weather stripping that Marcus kept meaning to replace. Weather was coming, the kind of weather that could bury the basin under feet of snow in a matter of hours. If this foal was going to survive, it needed more than honey water and hope. Marcus straightened, his back immediately reminding him of its limitations. The white horse backed up a step, giving him room to move, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the animal understood not just what was happening, but what needed to happen next. He looked at the foal, at the slight rise and fall of its chest beneath the blanket, then at the horse watching him with those impossibly knowing eyes. He had spent 4 years alone on this ranch, convinced that isolation was easier than connection, that keeping the world at arm's length meant fewer opportunities for loss. But standing in his kitchen with a dying foal and a wild horse that had chosen to trust him, Marcus felt something crack open inside himself, something he thought Kathleen's death had sealed shut forever. The clock on the wall read 6:15. Dr. Eliza North would be at her practice by 7, earlier if he called ahead. The woman was an outsider like him, another person Greystone had never quite accepted, which probably explained why Marcus had always felt a kinship with her despite their limited interactions. She had come from Denver with credentials nobody questioned and a past nobody discussed, setting up a veterinary practice above the old apothecary on Main Street. The ranchers used her services grudgingly, preferring the old vet who had retired, but they used her nonetheless because competence eventually won out over prejudice. Marcus moved to the phone mounted on the kitchen wall, an ancient rotary model that Kathleen had insisted on keeping because she loved the sound the dial made. His finger found the numbers, tracing them from memory, and he waited through 4 rings before a voice answered, professional but warm. Drive north. It's Marcus Webb, out at Crescent Ridge. His voice came out rougher than intended, scraped raw by 4 years of disuse in conversation. Mr. Webb, is everything all right? I need you to come out here. Now, if you can. I've got a situation that I don't know how to handle. There was a pause, the sound of movement on the other end. What kind of situation? Marcus looked at the foal, then at the white horse still standing in his kitchen. The kind you wouldn't believe if I told you. Just come, please. Another pause, longer this time. Then, I'll be there in 30 minutes. He hung up the phone and returned to the foal, resuming his careful administration of honey water. The little one seemed slightly more responsive now, its swallows coming a bit easier, though it still refused to open its eyes. Marcus talked to it as he worked, keeping his voice low and steady the way he used to talk to Kathleen during her worst nights, when pain medication couldn't quite reach the depths of her suffering. You picked a hell of a place to give up, he murmured. This ranch is barely holding on itself, but I guess that's fitting. Maybe we're all barely holding on, just looking for someone to notice. The white horse nickered softly, the sound almost conversational, and Marcus found himself addressing it as well. I don't know what you've been through, but it must have been desperate to bring you here. Must have taken something extraordinary to override everything you are just to ask for help. He thought about his own journey to this point, the path that had led from smoke jumper to invalid to widower to whatever he was now. There had been moments during Kathleen's illness when he would have done anything, traded anything, begged anyone if it meant keeping her alive. He understood the white horse's desperation on a level that went beyond words, understood it in the marrow of his bones. The cabin settled around them, the wood stove ticking as it cooled, the old structure creaking against the rising wind outside. Marcus continued his vigil, administering drops, monitoring breaths, and waiting for help to arrive. The foal remained balanced on the knife's edge between life and death, and all Marcus could do was keep offering it reasons to choose life, one drop of honey water at a time. Dr. Eliza North's truck appeared at the end of the long driveway exactly 28 minutes after Marcus's call, its headlights cutting through the gloom of an overcast morning. She drove a battered Ford that had seen better decades. Its blue paint faded to something closer to gray, but the engine ran smooth and reliable. Marcus watched from the porch as she parked beside his own rusted pickup, noting the efficiency with which she gathered her bags and approached the cabin. She moved like someone accustomed to emergencies, wasting no motion, her boots finding purchase on the icy ground with practiced ease. Eliza North stood perhaps 5'6", her dark hair pulled back in a no-nonsense braid that hung between her shoulder blades. She wore practical clothing, canvas work pants, and a heavy fleece jacket that had been patched at the elbows. Her face carried the kind of weathering that came from years spent outdoors in harsh conditions, though Marcus guessed she couldn't be much past 40. What struck him most were her eyes, a shade of green that seemed to catalog everything they touched, missing nothing. "Mr. Webb," she said as she reached the porch steps, then stopped abruptly. Her gaze had found the white horse standing just inside the doorway, visible through the open cabin door. The animal filled the frame completely, its pale coat almost luminous in the dim interior light. For several heartbeats, Eliza simply stared, her professional composure cracking just enough to show genuine astonishment. "That's a wild Mustang," she said, her voice carrying a note of disbelief. "In your house?" "There's a foal on my kitchen table," Marcus replied. "The horse brought it here about an hour ago. I've been trying to keep it hydrated, but I'm out of my depth." Eliza's eyes moved from the horse to Marcus, reassessing him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. She had treated a few of his cattle over the years, back when he still kept a small herd, but their interactions had been brief and purely transactional. Now she studied him as if trying to determine whether exhaustion or grief had finally pushed him into delusion. "Show me," she said finally, mounting the steps with her medical bags in hand. The white horse backed away as Eliza entered, giving her space to pass but never taking its eyes off her. Marcus saw her notice the way the animal moved, the careful deliberation in each step, the almost unnatural calm it maintained despite having a stranger enter its space. Wild horses fled from humans or fought them. They didn't stand patiently in kitchens watching veterinarians work. Eliza set her bags on the counter and approached the table where the foal lay wrapped in Kathleen's old blanket. Her hands moved with immediate purpose, checking vital signs, palpating the small body, examining the wound on the hindquarters. Marcus stepped back, giving her room, and found himself standing next to the white horse. Up close, he could see the scars that marked its hide, the evidence of a life lived hard in unforgiving country. "Body temperature is dangerously low," Eliza said, more to herself than to Marcus. "Pulse is thready. This wound is infected, probably a few days old. Dehydration is severe." Her hands continued their examination, gentle but thorough. "How much have you gotten into him?" "Maybe 2 tablespoons of honey water over the past hour. He's swallowing but barely." Eliza nodded, reaching into her bag for supplies. She pulled out a small catheter, tubing, and bags of fluid that Marcus recognized from Kathleen's hospital stays. "I'm going to establish an 4-line. His veins are compromised from dehydration, but I should be able to find something in his leg. I'll need you to hold him still." Marcus moved to the table, placing his hands on either side of the foal's body. The little one's eyes fluttered at the contact but didn't open. Eliza worked with practiced efficiency, her fingers probing for a vein, inserting the catheter with a steadiness that spoke of thousands of similar procedures. The foal flinched once, a weak protest, then subsided. "Got it?" Eliza said, securing the line and hanging the fluid bag from a hook Marcus had installed in the ceiling beam years ago for Kathleen's hanging plants. The liquid began its slow drip, carrying hydration and electrolytes into the foal's depleted system. "Now let's address this wound." She cleaned the injury with antiseptic solution, her movements methodical despite the obvious severity of the damage. The gash ran nearly 4 inches along the foal's hindquarter, deep enough to have damaged muscle tissue. "Barbed wire, most likely," she said. "He got tangled in a fence somewhere, probably panicked and tore himself free. The infection is advanced. If we'd waited another day, we'd be dealing with sepsis." Marcus watched her work, marveling at the calm competence she brought to a situation that felt surreal. Behind them, the white horse had moved closer again, its breath warm on Marcus's neck. Eliza glanced back at the animal, then returned her focus to the wound. "I'm going to debride the dead tissue and pack it with antibiotic gauze," she continued. "He'll need injectable antibiotics as well and something for the pain. The next 48 hours will tell us whether he's strong enough to fight this off." "Will he make it?" Marcus asked, surprised by how much the answer mattered to him. Eliza paused, meeting his eyes across the table. "Honestly, I've seen animals in better shape not make it, but I've also seen them pull through against worse odds. Wild horses are tougher than anything we've domesticated. If he inherited even half his mother's constitution, he's got a chance." "That's the mother," Marcus said, nodding toward the white horse. "Or father. I haven't checked." "Mare," Eliza confirmed, glancing back. "And she's magnificent. I've never seen a Mustang that color outside of photographs. White horses are rare in wild populations, too visible to predators when they're young. For her to have survived to adulthood means she's either incredibly lucky or incredibly smart." The mare stamped once, as if acknowledging the observation. Eliza smiled despite herself. Or maybe both. She returned to treating the wound, carefully removing contaminated tissue and irrigating the area with saline solution. The foal whimpered, a sound so small and pitiful it made Marcus's chest ache. He found himself stroking the little one's neck, offering what comfort he could while Eliza worked. The mare moved closer still, her large head hanging over the table now, watching every cut, every stitch, every bandage. "This is remarkable," Eliza said softly as she worked. "She's letting me do this. She brought him to you, she allowed you to bring him inside, and now she's standing here watching me perform surgery. Everything I know about wild horse behavior says this shouldn't be happening." Marcus thought about the desperation in the mare's eyes when he'd first opened his door, the deliberate way she had positioned herself between him and the foal until she was satisfied he meant no harm. Maybe she knows something we don't. Maybe she can sense when someone's trying to help. Maybe, Eliza agreed, though her tone suggested skepticism. She finished packing the wound and began wrapping it with sterile bandages. Or maybe she's just desperate enough to override her instincts. I've seen mother animals do extraordinary things when their offspring are in danger. Bears that charge vehicles, deer that attack dogs twice their size. Maternal instinct is powerful. The comparison made Marcus think of Kathleen again, the way she had fought against the cancer long past the point when doctors said she should have surrendered. She had clung to life with a ferocity that amazed everyone who witnessed it, as if sheer will could overcome cellular rebellion. In the end, will hadn't been enough, but the fight itself had been something to behold. Eliza administered injections, her hands steady as she pushed antibiotics and anti-inflammatory medication into the foal's system. These should start working within a few hours. The fluids will help stabilize his blood pressure and flush some of the toxins from the infection. But honestly, Mr. Webb, the biggest challenge is going to be keeping him warm and getting nutrition into him regularly. He needs to nurse, but I don't think his mother has been producing milk. Look at her ribs. Marcus turned to examine the mare more carefully. Beneath her thick coat, he could indeed see the outline of her ribs, the slight concavity of her flanks that spoke of hunger. She's been starving herself to feed him whatever she could. That's my assessment. Wild foals typically nurse for several months, but if she hasn't been finding enough forage, her milk would have dried up. He's probably been slowly starving for weeks. Eliza pulled a canister from her bag, a commercial foal milk replacer. We'll need to bottle feed him every 2 hours around the clock until he's stable enough to space it out. Can you handle that? Marcus looked at the foal, then at the mare, then back at Eliza. The commitment she was asking for wasn't trivial. It meant days, possibly weeks, of interrupted sleep and constant vigilance. It meant putting what remained of his life on hold for a creature he'd met only hours ago. For years of isolation whispered that he should refuse, should let the vet take the foal to her clinic where it could receive proper care without disrupting his carefully maintained solitude. But another part of him, a part that had been dormant since Kathleen died, was already calculating how to rearrange the cabin to make round-the-clock care possible. That part remembered what it felt like to matter to someone, to be needed, to serve a purpose beyond simply existing. I can handle it, he said. Eliza studied him for a long moment, then nodded. I'll show you how to mix the formula and use the bottle. The first few feedings are going to be difficult. He's weak and may not have the strength to suckle properly. You'll need patience. She prepared the first bottle while explaining the process, her voice taking on the cadence of a teacher walking someone through an essential skill. Marcus absorbed the information, asking questions when necessary, committing the proportions and techniques to memory. The mare watched the entire demonstration, her ears pricked forward with what seemed like keen interest. When the bottle was ready, Eliza attempted to get the foal to feed. She cradled his head, brought the nipple to his lips, and squeezed gently to release a drop of formula. The foal's mouth worked reflexively, but he lacked the strength to create suction. After several minutes of trying, Eliza sat back with a frustrated sigh. We might need to tube feed him, she said. It's not ideal, but if he can't nurse, we don't have much choice. Let me try something, Marcus said. He pulled up a chair beside the table and positioned himself so he could support the foal's head in the crook of his arm. The position reminded him of feeding Kathleen during her final weeks, when she'd been too weak to sit up but too stubborn to accept that she was dying. He'd learned then how to coax someone to take just one more sip, one more spoonful, one more small victory against the inevitable. He brought the bottle to the foal's lips and began talking, his voice low and steady, a constant stream of encouragement and reassurance. Come on now, little one. I know you're tired. I know everything hurts, but you've got to try. Your mama brought you all this way because she believes you can make it. Don't prove her wrong. The foal's mouth opened slightly, enough for Marcus to slip the nipple inside. He squeezed gently, releasing a small amount of formula, and felt the tiny throat work in a swallow. That's it. That's good. Just like that. One more now. He continued the process, patient and methodical, talking the entire time. The mare had moved even closer, her muzzle now resting on Marcus's shoulder, and he could feel the warmth of her breath against his cheek. It should have been terrifying, having a wild animal so close to his vulnerable neck, but instead he felt oddly comforted by her presence. After 15 minutes, the foal had consumed perhaps an ounce of formula, hardly enough to sustain life but more than nothing. Eliza watched with something approaching wonder on her face. You're a natural at this. Marcus shook his head. I've had practice with patience. That's all this is. It's more than that, she insisted. Animals respond to intention. He can feel that you're trying to help him, and so can she. She gestured toward the mare. I've been a vet for 15 years, Mr. Webb, and I've never seen anything like this. A wild Mustang allowing human intervention with her foal goes against everything I know about equine behavior. Maybe she's desperate enough to try anything. Maybe. Or maybe she chose you specifically. Eliza began packing her equipment away, leaving supplies for the next feeding. I'll come back this evening to check on him and change the forebag. In the meantime, keep him warm, keep trying to get formula into him, and watch for any changes in his breathing or consciousness level. If he starts convulsing or if his breathing becomes labored, call me immediately. Marcus nodded, committing her instructions to memory. Eliza pulled on her jacket and shouldered her bags, then paused at the door. Mr. Webb, what you're doing here, it matters. I know this valley hasn't been kind to you, and I know you've had reasons to keep to yourself. But this foal needs you, and whether you realize it or not, I think maybe you need him too. She left before he could formulate a response, her truck's engine starting up and fading down the driveway. Marcus remained at the table, the foal's head still cradled in his arm, the mare's presence a warm weight against his back. Through the window, he could see snow beginning to fall, fat flakes that would accumulate quickly in the rising wind. The isolation he had cultivated so carefully was being invaded, not by well-meaning neighbors with casseroles and platitudes, but by creatures that demanded nothing except his presence and his effort. There was something clarifying about that, something that cut through the fog of grief he'd been living in. He looked down at the foal, at the small chest rising and falling with slightly more vigor than before, and made a decision. If this little one was going to fight, then Marcus would fight beside him. Not because it would change the past or guarantee the future, but because right now, in this moment, fighting was better than surrendering to the slow erosion of purpose that had been eating away at him for 4 years. The mare nickered softly, and Marcus reached up with his free hand to touch her muzzle. Her hide was warm and surprisingly soft, and she didn't pull away from the contact. Instead, she leaned into it slightly, accepting the connection between them. Outside, the snow fell harder, beginning to erase the tire tracks Eliza's truck had left in the dirt. Winter was settling over Wind River Basin with the finality it always brought, transforming the landscape into something stark and unforgiving. But inside the cabin, surrounded by the warmth of the wood stove and the quiet breathing of creatures who had chosen to trust him, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt needed, and for now that was enough. The hours that followed became a rhythm Marcus hadn't experienced since Kathleen's final days, a cadence built around small necessities and quiet vigilance. Every 2 hours, he prepared a fresh bottle of formula, warming it to body temperature the way Eliza had shown him, testing it against the inside of his wrist to ensure it wouldn't scald the foal's tender mouth. Each feeding session stretched longer than the last as he coaxed the little one to take just a bit more, his voice a constant murmur of encouragement that filled the cabin's silence with something other than memory. The white mare never strayed far. She had claimed a position near the wood stove where she could observe both Marcus and her foal, her large body somehow fitting into the domestic space as if she'd always belonged there. Marcus found himself talking to her as he worked, explaining what he was doing and why, though he felt ridiculous narrating medical procedures to an animal. Yet the mare's ears tracked every word, swiveling toward him whenever he spoke, and her eyes held such focused attention that he couldn't quite dismiss the notion that she understood more than she should. By mid-afternoon, the snow had transformed the world outside into a wall of white. The wind drove the flakes horizontal, erasing the fence lines and the barn and everything beyond the immediate circle of the porch. Marcus was grateful he'd stocked up on firewood before the storm hit. Grateful, too, that he'd kept the propane tank full despite the expense. The cabin was an island now, cut off from Greystone and the rest of the basin, which suited him fine. Out here, it was just him and the horses and the simple question of whether the foal would see another sunrise. He had named the little one in his mind, though he hadn't spoken it aloud yet. Dawn seemed appropriate for a creature clinging to life in the gray hours before full light could arrive. The name carried hope without promising too much, acknowledged the precariousness of the situation, while still suggesting that morning might eventually come. Dawn's condition had stabilized somewhat since Eliza's intervention. The 4 fluids were doing their work, bringing color back to gums that had been pale as chalk. The foal's breathing had evened out, no longer the desperate gasping Marcus had witnessed at first light. But stability wasn't the same as improvement, and Marcus knew better than to mistake the absence of decline for the presence of recovery. He'd watched that particular fiction play out too many times during Kathleen's illness, those temporary plateaus that let you believe things might turn around before the next slide downward proved otherwise. The wound concerned him most. Despite Eliza's thorough cleaning and the antibiotics coursing through Dawn's system, the area around the gash remained hot to the touch, the skin radiating a heat that spoke of infection still fighting against the medication meant to kill it. Marcus changed the dressing every few hours, following the vet's instructions precisely, but each time he unwrapped the bandages he half expected to find the wound worse, spreading its poison through tissue too young and weak to mount an effective defense. During the 3rd feeding of the afternoon, something shifted. Dawn's eyes opened for the first time since arriving on Marcus's porch, revealing irises of deep brown flecked with amber. The foal blinked slowly, struggling to focus, and Marcus felt his breath catch. Those eyes held awareness, not just the dim flicker of basic life functions but actual consciousness returning from whatever dark place it had retreated to. "There you are," Marcus whispered, bringing the bottle closer. "Welcome back." The white mare surged forward at the sound of her foal's movement, her hooves clattering on the wooden floor. She thrust her muzzle toward Dawn, nostrils flaring as she took in her offspring's scent, checking for changes only a mother could detect. A low rumble emanated from deep in her chest, not quite a whinny but something more primal, and Dawn responded with a weak chirp that barely qualified as sound. Marcus watched the reunion with a tightness in his throat that he refused to examine too closely. The mare nuzzled her foal with a gentleness that seemed impossible from an animal so large and powerful, her lips barely grazing the soft fur as if afraid too much pressure might shatter something already fragile. Dawn leaned into the touch, drawing strength from contact that no medicine could provide. When the mare finally stepped back, apparently satisfied that her foal still lived, Marcus tried the bottle again. This time Dawn latched onto the nipple with more determination than before, creating actual suction instead of simply allowing liquid to trickle down his throat. The improvement was marginal but meaningful, and Marcus allowed himself a small measure of hope. The storm intensified as darkness fell, wind screaming around the cabin's corners, and finding every gap in the weather-stripping Marcus had been too depressed or too broke to replace. Snow piled against the windows, reducing visibility to nothing, and the temperature outside plummeted to levels that would kill exposed livestock in hours. Marcus built up the fire until the wood stove radiated heat in waves, then hung blankets over the windows to trap warmth inside. Eliza called around 6, her voice crackling with static from a poor connection. "The roads are impassable. I won't be able to get out there tonight. How's the foal?" Marcus gave her a detailed report, describing Dawn's opened eyes and improved suckling response. He mentioned his concerns about the wound's persistent heat, asked whether he should be worried about the amount of fluid draining into the bandages. "Some drainage is normal," Eliza assured him. "As long as it's clear or light yellow, that's actually good. It means the wound is purging infection. If it turns green or develops a foul smell, that's when we have a problem. Keep changing the dressing and monitor his temperature. I marked a thermometer in the supplies I left. Rectal temperature should stay below 102. Anything over 104, we're in trouble." Marcus thanked her and promised to call if anything changed. After hanging up, he took Dawn's temperature, a process the foal tolerated with surprising patience. 100.8. Elevated but not critical. He recorded the number in a notebook he'd started keeping, tracking feedings and vital signs with the meticulous attention to detail that his firefighting training had instilled. The evening feeding went better than Marcus dared expect. Dawn consumed nearly 3 ounces of formula, a significant increase from the single ounce he'd managed that morning. The foal's eyes stayed open throughout, following Marcus's movements with growing alertness. When the bottle emptied, Dawn even attempted to lift his head, the effort costing him visible strain but succeeding nonetheless. "Easy now," Marcus cautioned, supporting the small head with his hand. "Don't push yourself too hard too fast. Healing takes time." The mare had been lying down near the stove, her bulk taking up a considerable portion of the cabin's limited floor space, but she rose at Dawn's movement and approached the table. Marcus tensed, uncertain how she might react to her foal's increased activity, but the mare simply positioned herself alongside Dawn and began grooming him with her tongue, long slow licks that smoothed his disheveled coat and seemed to calm him. Marcus retreated to give them space, settling into the armchair that had been Kathleen's favorite. From there he could observe the horses while staying close enough to intervene if necessary. The scene before him felt surreal, like something from a dream or a painting rather than his actual kitchen on a November night. A wild mustang tending her foal on a table where Marcus usually ate his solitary dinners, both animals calm and trusting in a way that defied everything he knew about wildlife. His mind drifted to the question of how the mare had found him, what circumstances had led her to climb onto his specific porch rather than seeking help elsewhere. The basin held dozens of ranches, many of them more prosperous and better maintained than Crescent Ridge. Dale Kruger's spread alone employed 15 people and operated out of facilities that made Marcus's setup look like a child's playhouse. Yet the mare had chosen him, had somehow determined that this failing ranch and its broken owner represented her best chance. Maybe she had sensed his isolation, recognized a kindred spirit in someone who lived apart from the herd. Or maybe, as Eliza suggested, she had perceived something in Marcus that he no longer saw in himself, some capacity for care that 4 years of grief hadn't entirely extinguished. The idea made him uncomfortable, implied a responsibility he wasn't sure he could bear. It was one thing to keep a foal alive through sheer stubbornness and another entirely to accept that his ability to do so might mean something larger about who he was or who he might become. Thunder rumbled in the distance, An oddity in a snowstorm but not unheard of in Wyoming's unpredictable weather. The white mare lifted her head, ears swiveling toward the sound, and Marcus saw tension ripple through her muscles. She moved to the window, rising on her hind legs to peer through the gap between glass and blanket, and what Marcus saw in her posture sent alarm coursing through his veins. This wasn't the casual alertness of an animal monitoring its environment. This was fear, primal and electric, the kind that came from recognizing a specific threat. The mare dropped back to all fours and turned toward Marcus, and in her eyes he read a message as clear as spoken words. Something was coming. Marcus stood, his bad back protesting the sudden movement, and crossed to the door. He eased it open against the wind's pressure, just enough to scan the storm-racked darkness beyond his porch. At first he saw nothing but snow and shadows, the world reduced to shades of gray that revealed no detail. Then lightning flashed, and in that brief illumination Marcus glimpsed movement near the tree line where his property bordered open rangeland. Figures on horseback, at least 4 of them, pushing through drifts that reached their mounts' chests. Even at this distance and through the storm's fury, Marcus recognized Dale Kruger's bulk on the lead horse. The rancher sat his saddle like a man accustomed to commanding everything his gaze touched, and the rifle scabbard strapped to his saddle caught the lightning's flash and threw it back like a warning. Marcus slammed the door and threw the bolt, his heart hammering against his ribs. He'd known trouble would come eventually, had heard the talk in Greystone about the white devil horse that was spooking cattle and luring tame stock away from their pastures. The stories had started weeks ago, growing more elaborate with each retelling until the mare had become a phantom capable of supernatural mischief. That Kruger would use a blizzard as cover to deal with the problem spoke to how seriously the rancher took the perceived threat. The mare watched Marcus with those uncanny eyes, and he saw that she understood the danger as well as he did. She had probably encountered Kruger's men before, had perhaps been chased or shot at enough times to recognize them even through walls and weather. Her flight instinct was clearly engaged, every muscle coiled for explosive movement, but she remained rooted beside her foal, unwilling to abandon Dawn even to save herself. Marcus's mind raced through options and discarded them just as quickly. He couldn't hide the horses, not in a cabin this small with tracks leading directly to his door. He couldn't fight off for armed men, not with his bum back and no weapons beyond the old hunting rifle he kept in the closet, unloaded and buried under winter coats he no longer wore. He couldn't talk Kruger out of whatever he'd come here to do, not when the rancher had already demonstrated his intention by riding through a blizzard that left standing his ground and hoping his property rights meant something to men who'd already decided the law was on their side. It was a thin hope, barely substantial enough to qualify as a plan, but it was what he had. The pounding on his door came hard enough to rattle the frame, aggressive knocking that announced itself as a demand rather than a request. Marcus took a breath, settled his weight to compensate for his bad leg, and opened the door. Dale Kruger filled the entrance, snow coating his hat and shoulders like a mantle of authority. Behind him, 3 ranch hands sat their horses in a loose semicircle, their faces obscured by scarves wrapped against the cold. All of them had rifles, Marcus noted, and all of those rifles were positioned for easy access rather than secured in scabbards. "Evening, Webb," Kruger said, his voice carrying the false geniality of someone who didn't expect to be opposed. "Hell of a night to be out, but I'm tracking a horse that's been causing problems on my land. White Mustang, probably injured based on the blood trail we followed. Trail leads right to your door." Marcus didn't move from the doorway, using his body to block Kruger's view of the cabin's interior. "My property, Kruger. Whatever's on it is my business, not yours." The rancher's expression hardened, the pretense of friendliness evaporating like morning frost. "That animal has cost me 3 weeks of work rounding up spooked cattle and mending fence she knocked down. I've got a right to protect my investment, and the law says I can pursue nuisance wildlife onto neighboring property if I have cause." "The law says a lot of things," Marcus replied evenly. "It also says you need permission before entering someone's home, and I'm not giving it." One of the ranch hands shifted in his saddle, hand drifting toward his rifle, but Kruger raised a palm to still him. The rancher's eyes narrowed as he studied Marcus, clearly recalculating his approach. You protecting that horse, Webb? That what this is? I'm protecting my property rights. What's on my land stays on my land unless I say otherwise. Kruger leaned forward, and Marcus caught the smell of whiskey beneath the scent of horse and leather. The rancher had been drinking, which explained the poor judgment involved in riding out in a blizzard but made him more unpredictable and therefore more dangerous. You know what they're saying in town? Kruger asked, his voice dropping to something almost conversational. They're saying you've gone strange since your wife passed. Living out here alone, barely coming into Greystone, letting this place fall apart around you. Some folks think maybe the isolation has affected your thinking, made you sympathetic to things that ought to be dealt with. The implication hung in the air between them, ugly and unmistakable. Marcus felt rage kindle in his chest, hot and sharp, the first strong emotion beyond grief he'd felt in years. Get off my property, Dale. Now, before I call Sheriff Fairbanks and report you for trespassing and threatening behavior. Kruger's face darkened, but before he could respond, a sound came from inside the cabin. Dawn, gaining strength with each hour, had managed to produce a proper whinny, high and clear and unmistakably equine. The white mare answered immediately, her call deeper and more resonant, and Marcus saw recognition flash across Kruger's features. You've got that devil horse in your house, the rancher said, his voice thick with disbelief and contempt. And her foal, unless I miss my guess. Webb, you've lost your damn mind. Last chance, Dale. Leave now or I make this official. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other across the threshold, separated by inches and miles. Then Kruger stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. Fine, we'll go. But this isn't over, Webb. That horse is a menace, and sooner or later she's going to cause damage I can't overlook. When that happens, property rights won't mean shit. He turned and mounted his horse with the ease of someone who'd been riding since childhood, then wheeled the animal around and led his men back into the storm. Marcus watched until they disappeared into the swirling snow, then closed and bolted the door with hands that shook from adrenaline rather than cold. The white mare approached him slowly, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Marcus saw something other than desperation or alertness in her eyes. What he saw looked remarkably like gratitude, though he knew better than to anthropomorphize animal behavior too heavily. Still, when she lowered her head and pressed her muzzle gently against his chest, he couldn't help but interpret the gesture as acknowledgement, a recognition that he had stood between her and danger when running would have been easier. He rested his hand on her neck, feeling the power coiled beneath her hide, the wild strength that had carried her across miles of hostile territory to find help for her dying foal. They'll be back, he told her quietly. Maybe not tonight, but soon. And next time they might not bother asking permission. The mare held his gaze for another moment, then returned to Dawn's side. The foal was attempting to stand now, his spindly legs trembling with effort, and Marcus hurried to support him before he could fall and re-injure himself. Dawn's weight pressed against his arms, surprisingly substantial for something so fragile, and Marcus felt the rapid hammering of the foal's heart against his palm. Not yet, little one, he murmured, easing Dawn back down onto the blankets. Give yourself a few more days before you try walking. Healing doesn't happen all at once. But even as he spoke the words, Marcus recognized the truth in Dawn's instinctive drive to rise. Healing might not happen all at once, but it required the attempt, required showing up for the struggle even when success seemed impossible. The foal was teaching him something he'd forgotten in 4 years of grief, that the act of trying mattered independent of the outcome, that choosing to fight was itself a kind of victory. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the basin, piling snow against the cabin's walls and erasing any trace of Kruger's visit. Inside, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the quiet breathing of creatures who trusted him, Marcus felt the first stirrings of something he'd thought was gone forever. He felt purpose, and with purpose came the understanding that tomorrow would demand more from him than today had, that keeping Dawn alive meant accepting responsibility not just for the foal's physical survival but for protecting him from men who saw wildness as something to be eliminated rather than preserved. It was a heavy burden to shoulder, especially for someone whose back already carried too much weight. But as Marcus prepared another bottle of formula and watched the white mare curl her body protectively around her foal, he realized that some burdens were worth bearing, that sometimes the weight we carry defines us more truly than the freedom we seek. The night deepened around them, and Marcus settled into his vigil with the certainty that whatever came next, he would face it standing rather than retreating. For Dawn, for the white mare, and perhaps most importantly, for the part of himself that had been dormant since Kathleen died, he would hold the line. The blizzard raged for 3 days, burying Crescent Ridge under drifts that reached halfway up the cabin's windows and transformed the landscape into an alien world of white silence. During those days, Marcus existed in a bubble of routine so consuming that the outside world ceased to matter. Every 2 hours he prepared formula, coaxed Dawn to drink, changed bandages, monitored vital signs, and recorded everything in his notebook with the precision of someone who understood that small details could mean the difference between life and death. Dawn improved incrementally, each day bringing changes so subtle they might have escaped notice if Marcus hadn't been watching so closely. On the second day, the foal managed to hold his head up unassisted for nearly 5 minutes. On the third, he took his first tentative steps, wobbling like a drunk but remaining upright long enough to cross the small space between the table and the stove before his legs gave out. The white mare shadowed every movement, her body always positioned to catch her foal if he fell, and Marcus found himself doing the same, the two of them working in unconscious coordination to protect the fragile life between them. Eliza called twice daily when the phone lines remained functional, offering guidance and encouragement in equal measure. She talked Marcus through the process of removing the 4-line once Dawn's hydration level stabilized, instructed him on how to transition from bottle feeding to encouraging the foal to eat solid food, and praised his meticulous record-keeping in a way that made him feel competent for the first time in years. On the 4th morning, Marcus woke to silence so profound it felt like pressure against his eardrums. The wind had finally stopped, and when he pulled back the blanket covering the nearest window, sunlight so bright it made him squint reflected off pristine snow that sparkled like a sea of diamonds. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world scoured clean and impossibly beautiful. Dawn was standing on his own near the stove when Marcus emerged from his bedroom, the foal's legs still shaky but gaining strength with each passing hour. The wound on his hindquarter had finally begun to heal properly, the angry redness fading to pink and the heat dissipating as the antibiotics won their battle against infection. Marcus ran his hands over the small body, checking for fever or swelling, and found only the warm solidity of a young animal on the mend. The white mare stood at the window, her nose pressed against the glass, and Marcus understood what she was seeing. The storm's end meant the isolation that had protected them was also ending. Roads would be cleared, neighbors would venture out, and Dale Kruger would remember the unfinished business he'd left on Marcus's porch 4 nights ago. Marcus made coffee and stood at the window beside the mare, both of them staring out at the glittering expanse of snow. His supplies were running low, both for himself and for the horses. He needed to make a run into Greystone for more formula, more bandages, more grain for the mare who had been subsisting on hay meant for cattle. But leaving the cabin meant exposing himself to questions and judgments he wasn't prepared to face, meant confronting a community that had probably spent the blizzard spinning stories about the hermit who'd harbored a devil horse. The decision was made for him when he heard the growl of an engine fighting through deep snow. Marcus recognized the sound of Eliza's truck before it came into view, the veterinarian's Ford pushing through drifts with determined persistence. She parked in the cleared space near the barn that Marcus had spent 2 hours that morning shoveling out, and approached the cabin with her medical bags and an expression of barely contained excitement. "I had to see it to believe it," she said as Marcus let her in. Her eyes went immediately to Dawn, who was attempting to nurse from his mother for the first time since arriving. The mare had begun producing milk again, her body responding to improved nutrition and the constant presence of her foal, and Dawn was learning to latch properly despite his weakness. "My God, Marcus, you brought him back." Marcus shook his head, uncomfortable with the credit. "We all did. You, me, his mother. Mostly his mother, honestly. She never stopped fighting for him." Eliza set down her bags and approached the horses slowly, giving them time to accept her presence. She performed a thorough examination of Dawn, listening to his heart and lungs, palpating his abdomen, checking the healing wound with gentle fingers. When she finished, she was smiling. He's going to make it. I wasn't sure that first day, but he's definitely going to make it. The relief that flooded through Marcus was so intense it made him lightheaded. He'd been operating on stubborn hope and determination, refusing to consider the possibility of failure because considering it would have made continuing impossible. Now, hearing professional confirmation that Dawn would survive, something in his chest unlocked and he had to turn away to hide the sudden moisture in his eyes. Eliza pretended not to notice, busying herself with repacking her supplies. I brought extra formula and some grain for the mare. Also some groceries for you since I figured you were probably running low. Consider it payment for allowing me to witness something I'll be telling people about for the rest of my career. I appreciate that, Marcus managed, his voice rough. What's the word in town? Eliza's expression sobered. Dale Kruger's been talking. He's convinced half of Greystone that you're harboring a dangerous animal, that the mare is going to lead wild horses onto ranch land and cause chaos. Sheriff Fairbanks is trying to keep things calm, but there's pressure building. Some of the other ranchers are backing Kruger, saying wild horses need to be managed more aggressively. Marcus had expected as much, but hearing it confirmed still felt like a punch to the gut. What does Fairbanks think? Tom's a reasonable man, but he's also an elected official. If enough ranchers demand action, he'll have to do something. Eliza moved to stand beside Marcus at the window. There's been talk about organizing a capture operation, rounding up the wild herds and relocating them to federal land further north. It's happened before when populations get too large or when they're perceived as threatening livestock operations. That mare isn't threatening anyone. She was just trying to save her foal. I know that, and you know that, but fear doesn't care about facts. People are scared of what they don't understand, and a white Mustang allowing human contact doesn't fit into their understanding of how wild animals behave. It's easier to label her dangerous than to accept that maybe she's just intelligent enough to know when she needs help. Marcus watched the mare nursing her foal, the tender way she curved her body around Dawn to provide warmth and security. The idea of her being captured and relocated, separated from the territory she knew and the resources she'd learned to exploit, felt fundamentally wrong. She had trusted him with her most precious possession, had overcome every instinct that told her humans were dangerous, and he would be betraying that trust if he allowed her to be taken. There might be another option, Marcus said slowly, an idea forming even as he spoke. When I was fighting fires out in Idaho, I heard stories about a refuge in the northern part of the state. Cathedral Valley, they called it. Supposed to be a place where wild horses have lived for generations without human interference, protected by terrain too rough for ranching. I always thought it was just a legend, something firefighters talked about during long shifts, but maybe it's real. Eliza's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. I've heard similar stories. Some of my professors in veterinary school mentioned a population of Mustangs in Wyoming that had remained genetically isolated for decades, but I always assumed they were exaggerating. You think you could find this valley? I don't know, but I think I have to try. Marcus turned to face her fully. Dawn's strong enough to travel now, isn't he? If I take it slow, keep him warm and fed? Physically, yes. He's gained weight and the wound is healing well. But Marcus, it's still winter. Cathedral Valley, if it exists, is probably in the high country. You'd be traveling through snow with a young foal and no guarantee you'd find anything except more wilderness. I know the risks, but staying here means waiting for Kruger to come back with more men and more guns, and next time he might not be so easily turned away. If there's even a chance that valley is real, I need to take it. Eliza studied him for a long moment, and Marcus saw her weighing his determination against her professional obligation to discourage risky behavior. Finally, she sighed. If you're determined to do this, at least let me help you prepare. You'll need supplies, maps, and more medical equipment than I left you. And you'll need to know what to do if Dawn relapses or if the mare gets injured. They spent the next several hours planning the journey in detail. Eliza sketched maps based on her memory of topographical surveys she'd seen, marking the locations of passes that might be navigable in winter and warning Marcus about areas prone to avalanches. She made lists of supplies he'd need, calculating weights and volumes to ensure his old truck could handle the load. Most importantly, she gave him a crash course in equine emergency medicine, teaching him how to identify and treat common problems he might encounter on the trail. "When will you leave?" she asked as she prepared to go. "Tomorrow morning, if the roads are passable. The longer I wait, the more time Kruger has to organize opposition." Marcus walked her to her truck, grateful for the cold air that cleared his head. "Eliza, thank you for everything. You didn't have to help me, but you did anyway." She smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Maybe I helped because I understand what it's like to be an outsider. Or maybe I just believe that sometimes the rules need to be bent in service of something more important. Either way, good luck, Marcus. I hope you find what you're looking for." After she left, Marcus began the work of preparation in earnest. He loaded his truck with hay bales and grain sacks, secured tarps over the truck bed to create a sheltered space for the horses, and gathered every piece of cold weather gear he owned. He filled thermoses with water and packed enough human food to last a week, though he hoped the journey wouldn't take nearly that long. The old hunting rifle came out of the closet, cleaned and loaded for the first time in years, though Marcus prayed he wouldn't need to use it. As darkness fell, he stood in his cabin one last time, looking at the space that had been both prison and sanctuary for 4 years. The furniture Kathleen had chosen, the books she'd loved, the small touches that marked this place as once having been a home rather than just a dwelling. He'd been hiding here, Marcus realized, using isolation as armor against a world that had taken too much from him. But hiding meant not living, and somewhere in the process of saving Dawn he'd remembered what living felt like. He wouldn't be coming back, he decided. Even if the journey failed, even if Cathedral Valley proved to be nothing more than wishful thinking, he couldn't return to this cabin and resume the half-life he'd been existing in. Forward was the only direction that made sense now. Dawn was sleeping when Marcus loaded him into the truck, the foal barely stirring as Marcus arranged blankets around his body and secured him so he wouldn't slide during travel. The white mare was more complicated, her size making it impossible to transport her in the truck bed. She would have to follow on foot, trusting Marcus to lead her toward safety despite having every reason to distrust human guidance. He fashioned a loose lead rope from soft cotton, the kind that would break if she panicked rather than injuring her, and approached the mare with palms open and movements slow. She watched him come, and in her eyes Marcus saw the same calculation he'd witnessed that first morning on his porch. She was weighing trust against instinct, measuring what she knew about him against what generations of wild horses had learned about humans. Marcus stopped a few feet away and waited, letting her make the decision. The seconds stretched into a minute, then 2, and he began to think she would refuse. Then the mare took a single step forward, closing the distance between them, and lowered her head to accept the rope. "Thank you," Marcus whispered, his voice thick with emotion he didn't try to hide. "I won't let you down." They left Crescent Ridge before dawn, the truck's headlights cutting through darkness that felt heavy with possibility. The mare trotted alongside, her white coat ghostly in the pre-dawn gloom, and in the truck bed Dawn slept peacefully, unaware that his life had become a journey rather than a destination. Marcus drove slowly, conscious of the precious cargo he carried and the animal keeping pace beside him. And as the sun rose behind them, he didn't look back at the ranch that had been his refuge and his cage. The highway north was clear enough for travel, plowed by county crews but still treacherous with ice patches that sent the truck fishtailing when Marcus accelerated too quickly. He kept his speed steady, monitoring the mare in his side mirror to ensure she wasn't falling behind. She moved with surprising endurance, her powerful legs eating up miles without visible strain, and Marcus found himself admiring the efficiency of her gait. They stopped every 2 hours to check on Dawn and give the mare rest. The foal was handling travel better than Marcus had dared hope, though he remained groggy from the motion and the residual weakness of his recent illness. Marcus offered water and formula at each stop, pleased when Dawn accepted both readily, and allowed the mare time to graze on whatever vegetation she could find beneath the snow. By mid-afternoon they had left the basin behind, climbing into foothills where pine forests pressed close to the road and the snow lay deeper in the perpetual shade. Marcus consulted Eliza's maps frequently, taking unmarked turnoffs that led them further from civilization and deeper into country that looked like it had never known human habitation. The truck struggled on the steeper grades, its old engine protesting the combination of altitude and weight, but it kept moving forward, carrying them into wilderness that felt both threatening and welcoming. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Marcus spotted something that made his breath catch. A gap in the mountains ahead, a narrow defile that seemed to slice through solid rock, and beyond it a suggestion of green that shouldn't exist in late November. He pulled the truck to the side of what remained of the road, his heart hammering with a mixture of hope and disbelief, and walked forward for a better view. Cathedral Valley existed. The legends were true, protected by walls of stone that rose hundreds of feet on either side, warmed by geothermal springs that kept temperatures moderate even in winter. The valley spread before him like something from a dream. Meadows of grass, still green and lush, carpeted the valley floor. Cottonwoods clustered near streams that ran clear and unfrozen. And everywhere, moving through the landscape with casual grace, were horses. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, their coats ranging from bay to palomino to deep black, all living wild and free in a sanctuary humans had somehow never managed to destroy. The white mare had come to stand beside Marcus, and when he looked at her, he saw recognition in her eyes. She knew this place, had perhaps been born here before circumstances drove her out into the hostile world of barbed wire and bullets. This was home, the place where she and her foal could live without fear, where wildness was celebrated rather than suppressed. Marcus returned to the truck and carefully lifted Dawn from his nest of blankets. The foal was awake now, ears pricked forward with interest as he took in the new surroundings. Marcus carried him to the valley's entrance, the mare walking close beside them, and there he stopped. This was as far as he could go. The valley belonged to the horses, not to him, and his role was to deliver them to safety rather than intrude upon it. He set Dawn down in the grass, supporting the foal until his legs steadied beneath him. Dawn took a few wobbling steps, then gained confidence as he realized the ground beneath his hooves was solid and welcoming. The mare moved to his side, nuzzling him gently, and together they took their first steps into the valley that would be their sanctuary. Marcus watched them go, fighting the urge to call them back, to maintain the connection that had formed over days of shared struggle. But this was right, he knew it in his bones. They were wild creatures who had trusted him enough to accept help, and the greatest gift he could give them now was their freedom. The mare stopped after perhaps 50 yards and turned back to look at him. For a long moment, woman and man shared a gaze across the distance, and Marcus felt the weight of everything that had passed between them. She had given him purpose when he'd forgotten what purpose felt like. She had reminded him that trust was still possible even after betrayal, that connection could exist without possession, that sometimes the most important thing you could do was simply show up and try. Then she touched her muzzle to Dawn's flank, guiding him deeper into the valley, and they were gone. Marcus stood at the entrance long after they'd disappeared from view, watching the wild herds move through their sanctuary and feeling a peace he hadn't known since before Kathleen got sick. He had saved a life, protected wildness from those who would destroy it, and in the process had saved something in himself that had been dying slowly in isolation. When he finally returned to his truck, the sun was setting behind the peaks, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose. Marcus drove back down the mountain with an empty truck bed and a full heart, heading not toward Crescent Ridge but toward whatever came next. He didn't know where he would go or what he would do, but for the first time in 4 years, the uncertainty felt like possibility rather than threat. Behind him, in a valley protected by stone and legend, a white mare grazed peacefully beside her foal, both of them free and wild and alive. And that, Marcus thought as he guided his truck through the gathering darkness, was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Marcus drove through the night with no destination in mind, the truck's headlights carving tunnels through darkness that felt less oppressive than liberating. The empty truck bed behind him no longer represented loss but completion, the natural conclusion to a story that had begun with an impossible dawn and ended with freedom restored. His hands on the wheel felt steady for the first time in years, no longer trembling with the constant low-grade anxiety that had become his baseline since Kathleen died. By the time dawn broke over the eastern plains, Marcus had put nearly 200 miles between himself and Cathedral Valley. He stopped at a truck stop outside Casper, a fluorescent-lit island of humanity in an ocean of sagebrush, and ordered coffee and eggs from a waitress who looked like she'd been working the overnight shift for decades. The food tasted better than anything he'd eaten in months, probably because he was actually tasting it rather than mechanically consuming calories while his mind circled through memories of better times. He called Eliza from the payphone near the restrooms, feeding quarters into the slot until he had enough time to tell her the whole story. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished there was a long silence before she spoke. "You found it. You actually found Cathedral Valley." "I found it, and they're safe there, Eliza. Don was walking on his own by the time I left, and the mare looked like she'd come home after a long exile. There must be 100 horses in that valley, maybe more, all living exactly the way they're supposed to live. Dale Kruger is going to lose his mind when he finds out you're gone and the horses with you." Eliza's voice carried a note of satisfaction that made Marcus smile. "He's been organizing a search party, convinced you're hiding them somewhere on your property. Sheriff Fairbanks has been stalling, but he won't be able to hold Kruger off much longer. Let him search. He won't find anything except an empty cabin and a note on the door saying I've moved on." Marcus had written that note before leaving, keeping it deliberately vague about his destination or intentions. "What about you? Will this cause problems for your practice?" "Probably, but I've dealt with worse. Besides, I'm thinking it might be time for a change anyway. Greystone never really felt like home, just a place I landed when I needed somewhere to land. Maybe it's time to find somewhere that fits better." They talked for a few more minutes, making promises to stay in touch that they both knew might not survive the chaos of their separate lives, but which felt important to make nonetheless. When Marcus hung up, he felt the weight of connection, the understanding that even brief relationships could matter, could change the trajectory of a life in ways that persisted long after the people involved had gone their separate ways. He pointed the truck south and east, following highways that took him through country he'd never seen before. Wyoming gave way to Colorado, mountains rising like cathedrals on his left while plains stretched endlessly to his right. He drove without urgency, stopping when he felt like it, sleeping in the truck bed when motels seemed too expensive or too complicated. The weather held clear and cold, winter asserting itself but without the savage intensity of the blizzard that had isolated Crescent Ridge. 3 days into his aimless journey, Marcus found himself in a small town called Ridgeway, nestled in a valley where the San Juan Mountains met the high desert. Something about the place resonated with him, perhaps the way it seemed to exist outside of time, or maybe just the fact that the diner served excellent coffee and nobody asked questions about where he'd come from or where he was going. He rented a room above the general store, a spare space with a bed and a chair and windows that looked out on peaks that reminded him of the mountains that guarded Cathedral Valley. He found work easily enough. Ridgeway needed a handyman, someone who could fix leaking roofs and repair broken fences, and perform the 100 small tasks that kept a rural community functioning. Marcus's experience maintaining Crescent Ridge and his firefighting background made him valuable, and within a week he had more work than he could handle. The pay wasn't much, but his needs were simple, and something about working with his hands felt redemptive in ways that went beyond the practical. Winter deepened around Ridgeway, turning the mountains white and bringing the kind of cold that made every breath visible. Marcus settled into rhythms that felt sustainable, working during the day and spending evenings in his small room reading books he borrowed from the town library. He thought about Kathleen less frequently, and when he did the memories carried less pain, as if distance from Crescent Ridge had also created distance from the grief that had been soaking into that land for 4 years. He thought about Dawn and the white mare constantly, wondering how they were faring in their valley sanctuary. In his imagination they thrived, Dawn growing stronger with each day, learning from his mother how to find water in winter and which plants were safe to eat. The mare would be teaching him wariness too, the healthy suspicion of humans that would keep him safe if he ever wandered beyond the valley's protective walls. Marcus took comfort in these imagined scenes, finding in them evidence that his choice to let them go had been right even though it had cost him the daily contact that had given his life meaning. On a particularly cold evening in late December, Marcus was repairing a split board on Mrs. Henderson's porch when he heard the sound of a truck engine laboring up the steep grade that led into town. He looked up to see a familiar blue Ford, faded and weathered, pulling into the space in front of the general store. Eliza climbed out, her breath fogging in the cold air, and stood looking around as if trying to get her bearings. Marcus set down his hammer and walked across the street, his heart doing something complicated in his chest. "You're a long way from Wind River Basin." Eliza turned at his voice, and the smile that spread across her face was genuine and unguarded. "So are you. Took me a week to track you down. You're not easy to find when you don't want to be found." "I wasn't hiding, just moving forward." "How did you end up here?" "I asked around. Small towns talk to each other more than city people realize. A veterinarian in Montrose mentioned hearing about a new handyman in Ridgeway who spoke with a Wyoming accent and had a way with animals. I took a chance." She shoved her hands in her pockets, looking suddenly uncertain. "I probably should have called first, but I wasn't sure you'd want to hear from me." "Of course I would. Come on, let's get you out of this cold." He finished securing the board on Mrs. Henderson's porch, then walked Eliza to the diner where they claimed a booth near the back. Over coffee that was strong enough to strip paint, Eliza told him what had happened after he left. Dale Kruger had indeed organized a search of Crescent Ridge, bringing half a dozen men and finding nothing except Marcus's note. The rancher had tried to get Sheriff Fairbanks to issue a warrant, claiming Marcus had stolen valuable livestock, but without proof of ownership the claim went nowhere. The whole thing made Kruger look ridiculous, Eliza said with evident satisfaction. He'd been telling everyone about this dangerous devil horse, building it up into this huge threat, and then it just disappeared along with the crazy hermit who'd been protecting it. People started questioning whether the horse had ever been as dangerous as he claimed. Some of the other ranchers backed away from supporting his crusade, said maybe they'd been too hasty about calling for aggressive management of the wild herds. "What about you? Did you face consequences for helping me?" Eliza's expression clouded slightly. "Nothing official, but the whisper campaign was effective. Ranchers started taking their business to vets in other towns, spreading rumors that I was unreliable or too sympathetic to wild animals. My practice dried up over the course of 2 weeks. By Thanksgiving I was seeing maybe one patient a day, not enough to cover rent on the office." Marcus felt guilt settle in his stomach like a stone. "I'm sorry. I never meant for you to lose your livelihood." "Don't be. I'm not." Eliza leaned forward, her green eyes intense. "Losing that practice was the best thing that could have happened to me. It forced me to admit I'd been hiding in Greystone just like you were hiding at Crescent Ridge, using it as a place to lick my wounds instead of actually healing from what drove me out of Denver. The truth is I'd been looking for an excuse to leave for months. I just didn't have the courage to do it until circumstances made the choice for me." "So what are you going to do now?" "That's actually why I tracked you down. I've been offered a position with the Bureau of Land Management working with their wild horse and burro program. It's based out of Colorado, managing populations across the western states, ensuring they have adequate range and aren't coming into conflict with ranchers. The pay isn't great, but the work matters, and after everything that happened with Don and his mother, I can't imagine doing anything else." Marcus felt something release in his chest, a tension he hadn't known he was carrying. "That's perfect for you. You'll be amazing at it. I start in January, which gives me a few weeks to get settled. I found an apartment in Montrose, about an hour north of here." She paused, studying him over the rim of her coffee cup. "I was hoping maybe we could stay in touch. I know we don't know each other that well, but what we went through together, it felt like it mattered. Like maybe it was the start of something worth continuing." Marcus understood what she was offering, and more importantly what she wasn't. Not a relationship exactly, at least not yet, but the possibility of one. The acknowledgement that the connection forged over 3 desperate days caring for a dying foal might have substance beyond those circumstances. It was more than he'd allowed himself to hope for, and less than might have terrified him into retreat. "I'd like that," he said simply. "I'd like that a lot." They talked for hours, the diner emptying around them as the dinner rush came and went. Eliza told him about her plans for the BLM position, the populations she'd be monitoring, and the ranchers she'd need to work with to find balance between conservation and agriculture. Marcus described the work he'd been doing in Ridgeway, the satisfaction of fixing things instead of watching them fall apart, the way the town had accepted him without demanding explanations about his past. As night fell and the diner's owner began giving them pointed looks about closing time, they bundled into their coats and stepped out into cold that bit through layers like teeth. Eliza had booked a room at Ridgeway's only motel, and Marcus walked her there through streets silvered with frost and lit by stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. "Thank you for finding me," Marcus said when they reached her door. "I didn't realize how much I needed to know you were okay until I saw you step out of that truck." Eliza smiled, her breath creating clouds between them. "We saved something together, Marcus. Something wild and beautiful that the world wanted to destroy. That kind of experience changes people, makes it hard to go back to living small. I think maybe we both needed to find each other again to remind ourselves that what we did mattered." She went inside, and Marcus walked back to his room above the general store feeling lighter than he had in years. The future remained uncertain, but uncertainty no longer felt like threat. It felt like possibility, like the open road that had brought him to Ridgeway and might take him anywhere from here. Winter's grip on the mountains intensified through January and into February, but Marcus barely noticed the cold. His work kept him busy during the days, and twice a week Eliza drove down from Montrose to have dinner with him at the diner. They talked about everything and nothing, building a foundation of shared stories and discovered compatibilities that suggested something substantial might be growing between them. In March, when the first hints of spring began appearing in sheltered valleys and south-facing slopes, Eliza invited Marcus to accompany her on a survey of wild horse populations in the high country north of Ridgeway. It would be a week-long expedition on horseback, camping in conditions that would still be wintry despite the calendar's insistence that spring had arrived. Marcus agreed without hesitation, recognizing the invitation for what it was: a test of whether what they'd begun could survive the challenges of the work Eliza loved. They set out on a Monday morning with 2-pack horses carrying supplies and borrowed mounts that handled the rough terrain with steady competence. Eliza had maps and GPS coordinates for the bands she needed to observe, part of the annual census that tracked population health and movement patterns. Marcus's role was officially that of assistant, but he quickly became essential as his firefighting experience with backcountry navigation and his recent education in horse care made him valuable beyond simple pack-carrying capacity. The herds they observed ranged from small family groups to larger bands of 20 or more animals. Eliza photographed them from distances that wouldn't spook them, identifying individuals by unique markings and noting foals born since the last survey. She worked with focused intensity, and Marcus saw in her face the same expression he'd witnessed when she was treating Dawn: absolute commitment to preserving life that existed outside human control. On the fourth night, camped beside a stream where ice still clung to the banks despite warmer days, Marcus woke to the sound of hoofbeats. He emerged from his tent to find Eliza standing in moonlight that turned the world silver and black, watching a white horse approach from the tree line. His heart stopped, convinced for a moment that the mare had somehow found them, but as the animal drew closer he saw it was a different horse entirely, a young stallion whose coat gleamed pale in the darkness. "Cremello," Eliza whispered as Marcus joined her. "It's a rare color gene. I've only seen it once before in wild populations." She raised her camera, capturing images of the stallion as he paused to drink from the stream. "He's magnificent." Marcus watched the horse, thinking about the white mare who had brought her foal to his porch on an impossible morning. He wondered if the stallion was related to her, if somewhere in his bloodline was the same genetic variation that had made her so visible, so memorable. The thought connected him to Dawn and his mother across miles and months, a thread that persisted despite distance. The stallion finished drinking and moved on, disappearing back into the trees as silently as he'd arrived. Eliza lowered her camera, and when she turned to Marcus her eyes were bright with emotion. "This is why the work matters," she said softly. "Animals like that stallion, like Dawn's mother, they deserve to exist on their own terms, not as commodities or nuisances, but as wild things living wild lives. Every time we prevent a roundup or negotiate better range access or simply document that these herds are healthy and thriving, We're protecting something irreplaceable. Marcus pulled her close, feeling the cold air around them and the warmth where their bodies touched. You're doing important work. I'm proud to be even a small part of it. They stood that way for a long time, watching moonlight play across snow and stone, and Marcus felt the last pieces of his grief finally release their hold. Kathleen would have loved this, he thought. She would have loved watching the stallion drink, loved the simple beauty of being in wild places with someone who understood why those places mattered. Her loss would always be part of him, but it no longer defined him, no longer dictated the boundaries of what he could feel or experience. When they returned to Ridgeway a week later, exhausted and windburned but satisfied with the survey results, Marcus made a decision. He couldn't continue living above the general store, doing occasional handyman work while Eliza built her career an hour away. He needed purpose beyond simple survival, needed to contribute to something larger than himself. He applied for a position with the BLM as a field technician, using his firefighting experience and the references Eliza provided to secure an interview. The hiring manager, a weathered woman named Patricia who had been working with wild horses for 30 years, asked him why he wanted the job. Marcus thought about Dawn struggling to swallow honey water, about the white mare's amber eyes burning with desperate trust, about standing at the entrance to Cathedral Valley and watching wildness walk free. Because I learned that some things are worth protecting even when protection is difficult. Because I've seen what happens when we give wild creatures the space to be what they are instead of what we want them to be. And because I think maybe I've been given a second chance to do work that matters, and I don't want to waste it. Patricia studied him for a long moment, then nodded. You start in 2 weeks. Don't disappoint me. He didn't. Over the following months, Marcus threw himself into the work with an intensity that surprised even Eliza. He learned to identify individual horses by their markings, to assess range conditions and water sources, to mediate between ranchers and conservationists who both had legitimate interests in how public lands were managed. The work was hard and often frustrating, but it mattered in ways that felt concrete and measurable. By the time summer arrived, Marcus and Eliza had become a team both professionally and personally. They shared an apartment in Montrose, worked adjacent territories, and spent evenings comparing notes and planning surveys. It wasn't the life Marcus had imagined when he was younger, wasn't the comfortable domesticity he'd built with Kathleen at Crescent Ridge, but it was a good life, a meaningful life, and he was grateful for it. On a July evening when heat finally penetrated even the high country, Patricia called Marcus into her office. She had a laptop open on her desk, showing what appeared to be trail camera footage from a remote location. I need you to look at something. Marcus leaned closer to the screen, and his breath caught. The footage showed a valley he recognized, Cathedral Valley, and in that valley were 2 white horses, a mare and a yearling colt, both of them healthy and thriving, grazing peacefully among a larger herd. We've been monitoring that population for years, Patricia said, but we'd never seen white horses there until this spring. The mare appeared first, heavily pregnant, and gave birth to the colt in April. He's thriving, which is remarkable given that white horses usually don't survive long in wild populations due to predation. But this valley seems to protect them, and the herd has accepted them completely. Marcus couldn't speak, couldn't do anything except stare at the screen where Dawn, now nearly full-grown and strong, grazed beside his mother. They had survived the winter. They had thrived. Everything he had hoped for them had come to pass. I thought you'd want to know, Patricia said gently. Eliza mentioned you had a special interest in white horses, though she didn't explain why. I figured you had your reasons. Thank you, Marcus managed. Thank you for showing me this. That night he told Eliza everything, the full story he'd been carrying since November. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished she took his hand and squeezed it hard. You saved them both, she said. Not just physically, but you gave them their lives back. That mare will probably have more foals, and Dawn will grow up to have offspring of his own. And because you refused to give up during those 3 days, that entire lineage gets to continue. That's not small, Marcus. That's enormous. Marcus thought about the man he'd been in November, isolated and grieving, convinced that his capacity to care had died with Kathleen. He thought about the impossible dawn when a white mare had stood on his porch with a dying foal, demanding that he choose between safety and risk, between isolation and connection. She had given him a gift that morning, though he hadn't understood it at the time. She had given him a reason to try again, to believe that effort mattered even when outcomes were uncertain. "I'm glad she found me," he said quietly. "I'm glad she trusted me enough to ask for help." "She knew what she was doing," Eliza replied. "Animals have instincts about people that we don't fully understand. She looked at you and saw someone who would fight for her foal the same way she would. And she was right." They sat together as darkness fell over Montrose, talking about the work they would do and the herds they would protect and the life they were building together. Outside their window, stars emerged one by one. The same stars that shone over Cathedral Valley, where a white mare and her colt lived free from fear. Marcus watched those stars and felt peace settle into spaces that grief had hollowed out, filling them with something that felt remarkably like hope. The past would always be part of him. Kathleen's memory, the years at Crescent Ridge, the losses that had shaped who he was. But the past no longer imprisoned him, no longer dictated the boundaries of what he could become. He had been given a second chance at purpose, at connection, at matching, and he intended to honor that gift by living fully in the present rather than constantly mourning what was gone. Somewhere in a hidden valley, a white mare watched over her growing colt, both of them wild and free and thriving. And in an apartment in Montrose, a man who had once believed his story was discovered that sometimes the most important chapters are the ones you never see coming, the ones that begin with an impossible dawn and a choice to say yes when everything in you wants to say no. Marcus Webb had saved a foal's life and found his own in the process. It was, he thought as sleep began to claim him, a fair trade. More than fair. It was everything. Years passed in the high country, each season bringing its own rhythm to the work Marcus and Eliza had devoted themselves to. The wild horse populations they monitored grew and shifted, herds moving across territories that had sustained them for generations. Marcus became known among ranchers as someone who listened before he spoke, who understood that their concerns about grazing competition were legitimate even when solutions required compromise. He negotiated water access agreements and seasonal grazing rotations, finding middle ground between conservation and agriculture that let both thrive. Cathedral Valley remained his favorite assignment, though he visited only twice a year during official surveys. The valley had become something sacred to him, a place where the impossible had proven real and where wildness persisted despite everything working against it. Each visit brought the hope of glimpsing white horses among the larger herd, though he told himself their absence wouldn't diminish what they'd accomplished together. On a crisp October morning 5 years after he'd first delivered Dawn and his mother to the valley's entrance, Marcus stood at that same spot with Eliza beside him. They'd been married for 3 years now, a small ceremony in Ridgeway with Patricia as witness and half the town in attendance. Life had settled into something Marcus never expected to find again after Kathleen died. A partnership built on shared purpose and mutual respect that deepened with each passing season. The valley spread below them, autumn turning the cottonwoods gold against evergreen slopes. Through his binoculars Marcus scanned the herds, counting and cataloging as he'd been trained to do. Then he stopped, his breath catching as he focused on a small group grazing near the northern creek. A white mare, older now but still magnificent, stood watch over 2 younger horses. One was Dawn, fully mature and powerful, his coat gleaming in morning light. Beside him grazed a yearling filly, also white, her small frame suggesting she was Dawn's offspring. "Eliza," Marcus said quietly, handing her the binoculars, "look at the North Creek." She raised the glasses and went still. When she finally lowered them, her eyes were bright with tears. 3 generations. "Marcus, there are 3 generations of white horses in that valley because you refused to give up." Marcus watched the small family, thinking about the desperate mare who had climbed onto his porch and changed everything. She had trusted him with her most precious gift, and he had honored that trust by giving them freedom. Now that gift had multiplied, creating a legacy that would persist long after he was gone. It was more than he'd dared hope for, more than any reward he'd sought. It was simply right, the way things were supposed to be when humans remembered they were caretakers rather than masters of the wild places. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.